Welcome, everyone, to the March installment of the IPM Hour. Today's speaker, Andony Melathopolis, is an assistant professor at Oregon State University. He completed his undergraduate work and master's work at Simon Fraser in Burnaby and completed his PhD at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Some of his work in Canada focused on biomarkers for honeybee molecular breeding programs, and the focus of his work in Oregon has been mostly on the impacts of various stressors, including pesticides, on pollinator health. He has several citizen science projects to document the status of honeybee health, bee health, broadly speaking, in Oregon, including a Master Gardener Certificate Program and the Oregon Bee Atlas. And today he is going to talk to us about IPM and pollinators. Andony, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Let me get this up and running. I was just going to say the Simon Fraser thing. I did my master's there when there was still the Masters of Pest Management. So I'm one of the few people who have an MPM. All right, I got that the right way around? Everything's running okay?
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be part of the IPM Hour, and thanks to Steve for extending an invitation to invade your lunch break with a talk of with some thoughts that have been percolating in my mind about the connection and maybe disconnection between IPM and bee health objectives. To begin, ought there not to be a strong match between IPM and bee health? Now, this sentiment is expressed well by my colleague and collaborator, Rufus Isaac at Michigan State University. He asserts in a recent opinion piece in PNAS that IPM not only remains, quote unquote, relevant, but that by hooking up, I had the matching up with my title, but by hooking up with pollinators, there can be a new phase of agricultural entomology because the yield enhancing dimensions of pollination connected to IPM would be a great match. Today, I want to soberly assess this claim, or at least open it up for discussion. So I want to start by remarking on the shared assumptions of IPM and bee health that make such a marriage plausible. I then want to address what I perceive as the antagonisms between the two, which I don't see talked about, and maybe this is a forum for bringing it up. And I want to conclude with some thoughts on what can be done to better resolve the relationship between IPM and bee health. So let's begin with shared assumption. And clearly one of them is beneficial insects in general and habitat. Now, here's George Kaufman from AgriCare. He's an agronomist with AgriCare, standing by a mile-long hedgerow, and there's a number of them on this hazelnut and blueberry farm with plants for beneficial insects. And we have a weekly podcast at OSU, and I had George on recently, and he pointed out that they do it's a very sophisticated operation. They, for example, have methods of pruning the hedgerow sections in a way to manage shrub size, but also to extend the bloom phenology, providing pollen and nectar resources extended over the season by having the prune part bloom a little bit later. So this is already happening in agriculture. And as you can see, the way he concludes it is for bees and other beneficial insects. For George, the beneficial insects, the biocontrol may be more important than even the pollinators. And we certainly see this, bits of this. I imagine for participants in California, this is even to a larger extent. Here we see a planting of a very great bee plant, Lacey-Phacelia, in a hazelnut orchard. A lot of this work has been done by my colleague at OSU, Nick Wyman, looking for brown marmorated stink bug control. So the same plant that serves bees could serve pollinators. And I just want to quickly mention that there's ongoing work here at OSU. My colleague, Marcel Moretti, has been doing extensive work, specifically trying to find good matches for hazelnut orchards. He's doing pre-emergent herbicide trials, and here you can see a matrix. If we look at it from above, you can see on the rows, he's got different plants that are very good for beneficial insects, including bees, and different pre-emergent herbicide combinations. Work like this allows us to come up with some good recommendations for growers. In addition, beneficial insects and pollinator habitat comes in when we think about vegetation management. This is a recent presentation that was supported by the Western IPM Center, coming up with a training for vegetation management, mainly Department of Transportation staff. And when I do the exit polls from that training, you can see there's a lot of interest. You know, people would like to develop a better eye and identification for plants that support bees in rights of ways. And they want to change their mowing heights, and they're very motivated to actually start to look at plant plants along rights of ways, things like rabbit brush, which in the eastern part of the eastern part of Oregon is one of the most important bee plants out there. Here you can see this is the smallest bee that we have in the state in the genus Perdita. There's a whole lot of genera that specialize on rabbit brush, and they're all on rights of ways. The other good fit between IPM and pollinators, of course, is the kind of commitment to reduce insecticide and fungicide use. In beekeeping, this goes back to the 1980s. This is a bee kill in Colorado at the time when a new formulation of parathion was microencapsulated parathion. There was a lot of interest among the beekeepers for making sure in agriculture there was reduced pesticide use. And most recently here in Oregon, there was a insecticide kill in an urban setting with shade trees that also seems to have a strong connection with IPM. A third thing, a similarity that I think we share that maybe is overlooked, is this problem of being contextual. That IPM, there is no blanket IPM recommendation. It is the anti-silver bullet ethos. And in some ways, pollinator protection is the same. Consider a problem that I face. I have to figure out pollinator protection on this crop, which is chicory for seed. At the same time, right across the road, different pest management contexts entirely, we have a white clover seed field. And when it comes to bee health, and if you think about just the state of Oregon, there's a lot of different crop systems that have to be navigated to come up with something that is, meaningful. You need recommendations that can span all of these cropping systems. And not only that, it has to span multiple species of bees. So many of these crops are pollinated almost entirely by honeybees. But when you go to the eastern part of the state, all that purple, the alfalfa is pollinated by completely different species, alfalfa leaf-cutting bees and a native bee, the alkali bee. The Pacific Northwest region is also home to the largest production of the blue orchard bee, which increasingly is being used in California for California almond production. And we have a number of crops like red clover that experience high levels of native bee population from things such as bumblebees. To just press this point of contextualization forward even more, we have situations like this where you can have a crop in bloom, where bees are being contracted here in sweet cherries, and right across the fence, there's somebody who has an earlier variety with petal fall who wants to do pest management because the petals have left. Even more complicated, here we are. My colleague, Dr. Sagili, who's on the call, works extensively in carrot seed fields. Here we have two pollinator systems. And in the carrot seed field, those colonies are rented for hybrid carrot seed pollination. But right across the road, there could be an alfalfa seed field where the grower is experiencing high weevil pressure, owns their own bees, and may want to spray during bloom when there's bees on it because they're willing to take the loss on their own bees. But those honeybees don't know that there's that they're different, they're different ownerships and maybe crossing over, leading to some kind of pesticide exposure. Here's another situation that just baffles. How do you come up with best management practices in a system like this? Here you have a beekeeper who's got bee colonies. As the blackberries that you see on the left there come out of bloom, the bees get very hungry. There's not a lot out there. Aphid pressure builds up on a Christmas tree farm, and those bees then move into the Christmas trees, and growers who are trying to control aphids now have a conflict with bee health. So we have this shared assumption of like complicated scenarios. IPM and bee health share this together. Now I want to move to the unspoken, what I think are the unspoken antagonisms. There are a lot of initiatives, including we have one here, the Pollinator Stewards Program here in Oregon, where as part of pollinator stewardship, we emphasize IPM. In fact, in our online training, Chris Hedstrom developed a number of modules in principles of integrated pest management. To get certified as a pollinator steward in the state of Oregon, you have to go through Chris's modules. In addition, if you go to any of the bee certification programs, here's the one by Pollinator Partnership, you see right up front, to qualify to get this sign on your farm, to put this logo on your package of almonds, you have to have an integrated pest management program. And if you go and try to register for the program, you'll see there's a number of things here. Very IPM, do you monitor for pests? How do you monitor for pests? How often does the monitoring occur? Do you use economic thresholds? Do you use forecasting? Tell us about your preventative techniques. All of this, somebody who wants to certify their farm for bee-friendly farming has to sort of show that they're practicing IPM. But things start to run into a bit of a problem when we consider some of the other elements of IPM. So here it asks, do you limit pollinator contact with chemicals? And one of them is establishing buffers between treated areas, hives, or pollinator habitat. Now, clearly, this is something that's compatible with IPM. When this person comes and is spraying those cherries, they need to turn that air blast sprayer off so that they don't get insecticide or fungicide into this adjacent habitat, which will be serving not only pollinators, but all sorts of other beneficial insects. But consider this situation, which is being investigated by my colleagues in SCRI that Rufus Isaac is heading up. Here we have a situation where, we can mitigate for pesticide exposure. There is a practice where, in many agricultural situations where beekeepers are asked to put their colonies right up against the crop, but they could be mitigated by just moving them back 20 feet. The same spray occurs, but now with a bit of a buffer, the impact to the honeybees themselves goes down, yet other beneficial insects are still, subject to the sprays that are occurring. I think a more problematic assertion, and maybe the central one that I want to raise today, is this one. Never apply a pesticide in the presence of bloom that might attract pollinators. What this essentially translates into are recommendations in many pest management practices of really not spraying during bloom, focusing on using broad spectrum insecticides to clean up pest problems before in this case, the cherry comes into bloom. And then if you have a problem that develops, waiting until bloom is done, and maybe being very careful with drift, but really selecting that time for doing sprays. This is certainly very central to what we've been doing here in Oregon. You can see my colleague Ramesh Sagili there. We sit down with our various crop groups in the state. Here we are with the Clover Commission, crop consultants, extension, growers, and sort of come up with these programs that everybody can agree to protecting their pollinators. And here's the one for specialty seed growers. This is part of the agreement. They get an infographic. We train on it at their field days, telling them how pollination should occur to protect pollinators and for the growers to get maximal benefits. But right at the beginning, call your beekeeper 10 days before colonies move in, and let them know, and make sure you get a hard insecticide on 4 days before those colonies move in. That's the recommendation, to apply this cleanup spray at the bolting stage. And so we have this situation where, we're trying to get sprays on regardless of whether thresholds have been met, regardless of whether what the pest pressure is, to anticipate not spraying during this time. Now at bloom, we have this a different set of situations, which also I think in some ways is very bee specific. So avoid spraying at bloom. If you have a pest problem at bloom, some products enable you, they have short residual times that allow you to spray in the evening, even if they're toxic to bees. And this is covered in the label review manual of EPA. You can pick up any insecticide. In the environmental hazards section, you'll have a statement about toxicity, but then there'll be this other statement that indicates how long the product remains toxic. And in the label review manual, it points out that if the label says do not apply when bees are actively foraging versus foraging, have two different meanings. You can see on the brigade label, it says foraging. And what this implies is that the product has a residual time 25 less than 8 hours. This means the product will be 25%, will kill less than 25% of the bees in less than 8 hours. So if at 8 hours, the toxicity wears off. And so you have a situation here where it suggests if the product had said that, you could apply on a crop at full bloom in the evening. Whereas where you see the word actively disappear, it suggests the product has a longer residual time and can't be applied until petal drop. But in this first instance, not in the instance of brigade, but other products, this enables the grower to go on and apply pest management products by virtue of the natural history of bees being such that they don't forage in the evenings, unlike a lot of other beneficial insects. I will point out these are based on these trials. We do a lot of work here at OSU looking at residual toxicity. So, the way this works is you go and you harvest the tissue, plant tissue at 3 hours, you put bees on them. You can see in this case, with the bifenthrin, the product is still active on that leaf material if harvested at 3 hours. At 24 hours, more bees are alive with the bifenthrin. And in fact, it remains toxic on leaf tissue for 4 days. And so we've done more of this work here at OSU. Here we are working, this is in conjunction with Danny Lytle, our IR4 staff member, and Nicole Anderson, working in white clover. And notably, I want to point this other point out, is that when we look at the percent dead bees after 12 hours of weathering, many of our broad spectrum insecticides, which say, don't apply when foraging, they remain toxic on the leaf material. They remain 100% toxic to bees. Whereas some of our newer compounds, the newer active ingredients, which are break down overnight, even though they're toxic to bees, have much shorter residual times. Thing I want to point out as well is that these products are selective. So they often aren't as broad spectrum as, say, bifenthrin is. And what ends up happening is a situation where previously people would go in with a hard cleanup spray, try to control their pests, to a situation that I think we're developing to, and Ramesh and I certainly heard from the clover seed growers, where they're applying increasingly during bloom with 1 or 2 selective insecticides, because one won't clean up the other pest problems. So there's actually perhaps more sprays at bloom happening. Final thing I want to point out is that there is a bit of a conflict when you're in vegetation management, noxious weeds and bees. If you are in the state of Washington, you probably know about the wars between the beekeepers and anybody doing invasive weed management over knapweed. And certainly thistle is one of the best bee plants that I know in terms of the broad spectrum of bees that are approached to it. Terrible weed problem. Okay, with that, I do want to come to this question of what is to be done. How do we deal with some of these issues, and specifically the recommendations that may not mesh up with IPM? The first thing is, I think it's important, if there is a connection between IPM and pollinator management, it needs to be researched. It should not be assumed. And certainly when Rufus Isaac was writing his editorial, he had this piece in PNAS in mind. It's a great piece that comes out of Indiana, where you can see the title of the paper is great. IPM reduces insecticide applications by 95% while maintaining or enhancing crop yields through wild pollinator conservation. On the left, you can see a graph of striped cucumber beetle monitoring over time. And what you'll notice is that the economic threshold is 5 beetles. And in the conventional management system, the level of beetles always remains excessively low. Whereas in the IPM program, where they treated these watermelon patches only treating on the threshold, they were able to largely keep the beetles below the threshold levels. And so, although the levels are slightly higher, but as a consequence of that, if you look at these regressions on watermelon yield and other bees, I want you to notice two things. The one is the honeybees, and you can see the yellow is the conventional management and the blue is the IPM. The honeybees are kind of invariable to the pest management situation because, as I mentioned, they are there's a way to mitigate. You bring your bees in, you bring them out, they're less susceptible. But when you go to an IPM system method of management, you can see what happens. When you're using conventional management, there's very few wild bees that are coming into the pumpkin patches, into the watermelon patches. But as you transition to IPM, there are more bees. So this certainly seems to be the case that maybe there's a very strong connection between the two. But I will point out that this isn't always the case. This is research that I did for my PhD in lowbush blueberry. Now, we would expect if we had two treatments here, one where we withheld our insecticide and fungicide treatments and one where we had them in place, if we had the same situation that we saw with in the Pachenka study, where we had high levels of pollination, we would expect to have much more yield without any treatments. But in fact, we don't see that. This is where we've controlled pollination. At 100% pollination, in some ways, the plant cannot bear that fruit without having both fungus and insects controlled. Also, if you notice, the second thing that comes out of this study is that in all of these three treatment plots here, you can see the the ones that are 25% pollinated and the one that's 100% pollinated but received no treatment, they had depressed fruit set. And so when we look at berry weight, the only depressed fruit set treatment block that gets a boost is the one that has been treated with fungicide and insecticide. That the plant can, even in the absence of those treatments, the plant, even if it has reduced fruit set, is unable to realize a larger fruit. So that first key point, it really is it is contextual, and it may not be the case that in every situation, IPM approaches will lead to maximizing pollinator benefits. The second point, which I've indicated earlier, is we lack good approaches to thinking about thresholds, particularly when it comes to bloom. So I mentioned here in a commercial seed production field, there's going to be a number of pests that appear, but there is a point right now when this, maybe a couple days before this field bolted, that a pest management decision that can protect pollinators could be made, but yet thresholds may not be sensitive to this fact, that in a real IPPM, integrated pest management and pollinator approach, those thresholds would be adjusted for bloom. There would be some kind of acknowledgement that the manager's decision is really at this point if we want to avoid any sprays during bloom. And in many cases, those thresholds or the sampling systems occur after this point. The second thing to acknowledge is that those cleanup sprays and broad spectrum insecticides often will control multiple pests at once. And so as we transition to more selective insecticides, I think there's a good opportunity to try and see whether, for example, some of these perhaps secondary pests no longer occur because biocontrol starts to step in, or whether they persist, in which case, beekeepers may be facing multiple insecticide sprays at bloom where before they were not, under a situation when they were relying on broad spectrum insecticides for cleanup. I also think when doing pest management strategic plans, many of them that include bee pollination do not single out bloom. So there's all sorts of assessments of pest management, pest pressure and disease pressures that occur, but not specifically around bloom. And I really would commend the PMSP that was done for sweet cherries, where it was deliberately laid out as one of the decision points for growers in the rooms when thinking about when pest management was occurring, to single out bloom and periods when decisions need to be made for bee protection. I also think there is, I've witnessed that there's a disconnection between IPM and bee protection training to pesticide applicators. I certainly talk to a lot of pesticide applicators, as do many of my colleagues. They're a captive audience. They're there waiting for information. And when I've gone across, in 2019, I went across and asked people whether they had dedicated training for pollinator protection. Many of the states in the darker blue do. And in addition, when I asked the people certifying those credits, how many states had a special designation, a core credit designation, for example, for pollinator protection, you can see it's over a quarter. So clearly, pollinators are a great way to reach pesticide applicators. And there's a way in which we really need to be more deliberate and think about how we can bring IPM content into those pollinator pesticide trainings. I do want to shout out that some of this is being done. My colleague, Anna Heck, who's with a group called the MP3 Working Group, she's out of Michigan State University, have developed an online training. And there is an attempt to bring IPM into these trainings. And part of this looks like this, and this was supported by the Western IPM Center. We've developed some case studies with the Oregon IPM Center of key crops where pollinators, rented hives, and cropping systems come together, and trying to figure out ways that we can provide these case studies back to pesticide applicators on best practices for both accomplishing things like disease management in something like blueberries in a way that also protects bees. This has also been done in IPM for greenhouses, and there's work also being done in New Mexico on chili pepper production. The fifth thing is, I think IPM alternatives need to be spelled out more completely in what are called managed pollinator protection plans. If you're not familiar with managed pollinator protection plans, these are guidelines set out by EPA for each of the states to develop a set of protocols, a set of practices for protecting pollinators. At the core of them are these best management practices. And I would submit to you that there is not a lot of IPM content in those best management practices at present. And really, we're talking about a lot of state plans. And so I think working with the people who are largely in Department of Agriculture who are managing these plans and thinking about how to import IPM, the latest and most significant and impactful IPM, into the programs, I think is important. I know as I've sat down with Chris Hedstrom at the Oregon IPM Center, we've tried to sort of think through how these might plumb together, how we might be able to take various IPM activities and integrate bees into them. And I think this is schematic. I think having much more concrete, grower-friendly decision-making support tools is a direction that I would submit that we need to take. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover today. I wasn't sure. This is brand new for me. I was just pulling these slides together. I was trying to provoke a conversation. But I do want to thank the Western IPM Center for supporting work that we've done on training right-of-way managers, but also developing those case studies. And more recently, we'll be working on residual toxicity and label information, but also Western SARE, a lot of that habitat work that I told you Marcelo was working on is supported by NRCS. And we've been working closely with some of the commodity commissions. Okay, with that, what do you guys think? Match or swipe?
Well, I have some ideas, but I was going to wait for others to chime in first.
Well, Stephanie's been working on this very thing in California. I'm curious, Stephanie, what your thoughts are.
I think it's very complicated. And I think, it's you posed a lot of good points. I think that there is a lot of knowledge that is still needed and it's currently lacking in knowing whether there are native bees on the farm already and knowing how prevalent they are and where they are and when they're active. I think that there's not a lot of effort put into, especially in California, maybe more so in Oregon, just because of, you described red clover and white clover. But in my experience, I know squash is a major crop in some areas in California, and I'm surprised to find that growers are not sure if there are squash bees on their farm. I don't know. I could go on about this, but I think that we need more effort into documenting the presence of native bees and their contributions that they play in crop pollination. Because without that, it's very hard to develop a pest management plan that has them in mind to the full extent. Hope that makes sense.
It does, and I guess I kind of struggle with this. Maybe Chris has some thoughts on this as well, but it's, there's a whole host of beneficial insects out there, and it's strange that bees have this kind of, they are a beneficial insect, but they have their own category in some ways. And that it is a funny situation because you wouldn't have I don't know, a whole ladybug thing. It's like one taxa that has a kind of, and I guess it's because it does have a specific role, as you say, associated with production. In fruits that it's a very specific kind of beneficial insect. But, I guess it would, to raise your point is well, maybe there needs to be some way to prioritize beneficial insects in monitoring, because clearly there are some native bees that are flying around fields that do not contribute to pollination very much. They're terrible pollinators. They're there to steal nectar, to take a little bit of pollen, but they really aren't, to a grower's perspective in terms of yield. But it might be because they also have different life histories and there's different mitigation steps. And I think, I imagine those of you who do biocontrol run into the same problem, is which ones are which biocontrol am I trying to promote? Otherwise, I wonder if you just end up with such a broad set of practices that it's hard to, drill down to what a grower wants to know, which chemistry to use. And then it's just don't use any of them or something. Maybe that's a bit too extreme, but.
Well, like Stephanie said, it's complicated and it's difficult to make broad statements about very specific sort of circumstances. And like you pointed out, things are contextual. So you have to take that context, I think, into account certainly when you're making recommendations. It's interesting to note that several years ago, one of the main funding lines for integrated pest management through USDA NIFA, which is the Crop Protection Pest Management Program, got a boost in funding to the tune of about $3 million, of which all of it was applied, I think, most of that boost was applied to pollinator protection, pollinator health specifically. And I've noticed that that's kind of disappeared over time. As a matter of fact, now there isn't really anything specifically called out in that line anymore or in that crop protection pest management program for pollinator health. And so I'm kind of wondering why that changed. It just is one of those things where there seemed to be somebody, at least at the national level, seemed to be thinking that there was a marriage between integrated pest management and pollinator health. And I was wondering if maybe that perception had changed.
I don't know if anybody has any insights into the change, but I'll tell you one thing. I think it recurs. I run into it all the time. I've been on the Pollinator Partnership Task Force for Bee-Friendly Farming, and they ran into this situation where this is what happened. They were IPM as part of their program. They certify a bunch of different crops, and so it's unclear which crop has a substantive IPM system in place And I imagine that the funding agency was meant to bring those groups together, because they don't, they're pollinator people. They do not, they're not plugged into the IPM centers really well, and they don't know the IPM people. They don't know the extension, entomologist or pathologist to work with. And so they were asked, I think at one point, a large big box store asked them, well, we're going to impose this definition of IPM. And it struck me as a kind of backward, it got more generic and less specific. And I don't know what this, but clearly the funding stream was meant to bridge that. It's like, well, we need to sort of have both dimensions brought together, because the fact that, I'll say one last thing is, it's strange. The pesticide labels have a pollinator health dimension to them, and yet there's no beneficial insect, very little beneficial insect language on pesticide labels. So even EPA has, is comfortable or lives within this siloed approach. So I don't know why it disappeared, if anybody has insight into it, but. Chris, since you're on the call, you've attempted to bridge this. So you've been, you had to bang your head against the wall, going to a blueberry grower, trying to talk both things. What were your challenges in, going to the, the blueberry industry and trying to figure out the connection between pollinator protection and IPM?
I think, well, the one that we talked about is that it's complicated. I think Stephanie makes a good point. And also, hi, Stephanie. I haven't seen you for a long time. It's nice to see you.
Yeah.
It's the thing that I was seeing was that, well, one of the things you just said was that we don't see the crops that have IPM or the crops that have integrated pest management plans. It's farm-based, like it's not even a whole cropping system that's doing it. It's who in these different cropping systems are utilizing IPM. What does that mean? And then what are they doing, and what parts are they taking? Are they just reducing pesticides, or are they really looking at beneficial insects? And then when they're saying beneficials, do they mean beneficials, natural enemies, or do they mean pollinators? And it's totally dependent. It's case by case who you talk to and the extent of which they're trying to implement IPM, what they see are the issues, how they're defining IPM. It's like, I mean, we're this far into it and we're trying to make recommendations about pollinators, but I think the reality is that we need to take 6 steps back and start getting some definitions in place before we can get this specific. The ones that are, however, the ones that are implementing IPM, like you use the examples of some of those nurseries from the videos that we're putting together, and some of like AgriCare and some of the other companies, they are those 6 steps ahead, and they've got their systems figured out, and now they are implementing very specific practices with pollinators in mind and moving these things around. So as challenging as it is for like a huge broad subject, there's lots of work to be done, but the ones that are really enthusiastic about it, it's super promising. Like that Nico example, they totally, as soon as they started thinking about pollinators and natural enemies, they reduced their sprays to almost none, and in some cases none. And that's not totally, and that's inside greenhouses, and that's not uncommon. I've talked to multiple greenhouses that don't spray for spider mites anymore. They don't have to.
You know, the one interesting thing I think about the greenhouse industry and the green industries is that they can't, the pressure they got from consumers was around pollinators. So they were hammered with the neonic bans at the big box stores. And, when I was talking to Nico, and we have a podcast with him as well, he mentioned that he wasn't, and I mean, it's maybe the classic IPM aha moment for a grower is kind of like he thought he needed to use abamectin and was kind of concerned about is that what it was? No.
Yeah, it was abamectin. And
it was abamectin, and he was like, and then he sort of let off on it, and suddenly he noticed, if he did other things downstream, especially making sure that his transplants were clean, a lot of that wasn't around. But really what was driving him was a kind of pollinator, it was kind of the consumer pollinator concern was, the driving force that kind of augured IPM. And so even though clearly nothing that he grows is he has no dependency on pollinators, but his consumer, the consumer reaction around nursery plants that are grown with pesticides kind of drove him in that direction. And it kind of was a good motivator for IPM.
I think it's interesting because that's the same for, say, Monrovia. They don't use neonics anymore because of consumer pressure. And I wonder if it's just this direct connection in the consumer's mind where I'm buying a landscape plant, I'm putting it in the environment, bees are going to land on this. Even though that for some of the growers I talked to, they're not worried about residuals. They're more worried about it works for them for cost and bees that are coming into the, they don't want to affect bees that are coming in just into their greenhouses. Not so much the consumer, because they're just trying to get plants that look good, but they're able to do it the same way. And then it also saves on labor because they have no restricted entry intervals. So they can actually get labor in there faster if they have biocontrol, and they're saving money that way. So it goes back to their thing, their economics. But the consumer pressure direct being what it is that way is interesting because, and this is a conversation that comes up a lot, is what's the consumer perception of pesticides being used on food? And do we need another kind of certification beyond organic that's like an IPM kind of thing? The consumer pressure to implement these things, I think, would have a huge impact, like it did with organic or other things. But it's interesting about the landscape plants. Looks like Gwendolyn had a question. She popped up. Hi, Gwendolyn.
Sorry, had to unmute. Not a question, but just a comment. I think surveys have showed that consumers really don't use their money to spend on what they think. But Chris, when you're talking about another certification, growers don't want another certification, and we have bee friendly, and people are not going to really know what IPM is, and the stores, the retailers would be berserk. But I think it's a matter of education to the farmers and the consumers. And this is what I have done all along for the last 2 decades, is when you have blossom, you get bees and you get other beneficial insects like predators and parasitoids. And so it's a bonus. So if a farmer is interested in getting that pollination and having those native populations of bees, then you get to say, oh boy, howdy, look at this. You get a bonus because you get these beneficials coming to that blossom during XYZ, and they're going to work on your pest XYZ. So compartmentalizing those, Horses has done a really good job in the past of going beneficial insects. Yes, they include our pollinators, but they also include the predators and the parasitoids. But always when we're educating, we need to stop compartmentalizing, because yes, of course, pollinators are beneficial insects. And yes, of course, predators and parasitoids are beneficial insects. And when you go in a nursery, of course, they don't need that pollination for all the horticultural plants. They do when they find out that they don't have early aphids anymore because of the predators and the true bugs that are there. They are utterly happy, but sometimes that's a surprise. And what I'm saying with the university is that should not be a surprise. That should be what we're teaching, the whole of agriculture is this is what comes when you have this blossom. And so that's kind of my hit on it over the last 3 decades with growers.
It's a good point, Gwendolyn. I guess, there's the complications occur. Like, I wonder about one of the driving things, because in the whole bee world, you run into this kind of division between people who are for native bees, and then there's the beekeeping industry. And so the beekeeping industry is in itself kind of it's a special case. It's almost as if you had a biocontrol company, well, the equivalent of a biocontrol company that was so pervasive in an industry that it kind of raises to a special status. And I think the fact that beekeepers are so kind of plugged in a specific way is why, that's why EPA has a special line for that specific beneficial insect. And it's kind of like, it is a reality at the same time. And those, as I don't need to say this, but for the recorded audience, they're brought in at numbers, reliably at numbers that are kind of independent of landscape management. They may benefit, and I know there's, there has been efforts to show the benefits to bees, like the Seeds for Bees program in California of growing mustards for the bee colony health. But it is a kind of strange, it has a strange twist to it, because I think all that you say is true, but then the beekeepers in some ways are kind of the most important player in the room when it comes to these statewide plans. And in some ways for them, it's a different calculus or something. And it may be one of the reasons, maybe if honeybees were, for some reason, the beekeeping industry never developed, and it was entirely, it had to be endogenously grown pollinators, you would have a different situation. Although I will say what I noticed is, when you come to leaf cutting, people who grow alfalfa seed, they have no compunctions, even though they're their bees, of nuking them if they got a pest problem. I've seen it happen. They're much more, they will be much more, they have less compunction of spraying during bloom because they own the bees, which is a strange twist.
Hey, Andony, Stephanie has her hand up.
I just have a few things to add. Yeah, so one thing, along the lines of the beekeeping industry, it just kind of a note from when I was in, grad school. I studied honeybees, and I found it very surprising that there's kind of this clash between native bee people and honeybee people sometimes, where it's like native bees are more important. No, honeybees are more important. It's like, well, they're all important. Like, we need them all. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket. And so I think that it was just surprising to see that. But in terms of IPM, one thing that I have noticed in my time working in IPM on educational resources for growers is that there is a lot of disconnect between the people that are researching IPM practices and what is needed to protect bees. There's a lot of information in our resources saying, in order to manage this pest, you need to remove habitat. And so, we're telling growers for bees, you need to add habitat. And growers are like, oh, if I add habitat,
that's a good one.
I'm going to bring rodents. I'm going to bring birds that are going to, contaminate my crop. I'm going to bring, all sorts of insect pests. And there's just so much disconnect because there's so much information saying remove. And when we come in as pollinator people and we try to say, we actually need to add because otherwise we're in a bad situation, there's just so much up against us. And I just don't think that there's enough collaboration and connection between the IPM people and the pollinator people to understand how can we work through this as a whole systems approach, even in crops that are not pollinated by bees. Like for Christmas trees and for corn, like there are times when bees will be in that crop, even though you don't need bees to pollinate that crop. And so I think there's just so much work to do on the landscape level and at the multiple subject level, I guess.
Well, it made me think of Matt's question earlier about, there used to be a USDA NIFA line dedicated to this. And I think what happened to that line, Matt, it's now in the USDA pollinator health grant. There's a specific, that's what may have happened. And if you look at the request for proposals, it really highlights that. But I've seen the proposals that have been funded recently, and they're usually just by bee people or butterfly people. And I think there's real room for a good submission by a team that brings together IPM people and bee people in a real concrete setting. Like, I think that proposal would be received very well in that funding stream.
Yeah, Stephanie, I just wanted to say that, yeah, you make some really good points. I think a lot of times we're not connecting in IPM that you don't always have to create habitat. So you take that example of alfalfa, and you take the example of, many of farm walks in Eastern Oregon and Walla Walla, where I would see alfalfa crops right next to the onion seed crop. And when the grower learns all the hemiptera and the true bug predators in that alfalfa crop, that helps with all the seed pests they have in their onion crops, they were blown away. And you can bet that they stopped spraying their alfalfa for this crazy, mysterious early aphid that they really never had in that alfalfa crop. But so there are a lot of connections and collaborations that can be made with what's already flowering in that cropping system, and what comes there. The farmers don't know anything about. And there's a ton of urban legend out there about what habitat brings to a farm. And what I've been doing for the last 20 years is fighting against that urban legend and working for farmers to understand what benefits come from that habitat as well. But it's like you say, it's really important to collaborate. It's really important to inform IPM practitioners of these systems and that what's already available for those beneficial insects and native pollinators. And Andony, I just want to tell you that throughout my work, we have always considered beekeepers as they're like livestock producers. And they certainly have a lot of power, just like the Cattlemen's Association. But it's not something, that's kind of how I have reacted to some of that compartmentalization, because that's what they're do. They're producing those bees.
They are, but they also, I would say, like, we should be realistic. Like when you're in Oregon, the bulk of pollinated crops are by honeybees. There's coastal cranberries and there's red clover, and the rest of them really do rely on those bees. And so they are they're not quite the cattlemen's. I would say they're not even close. They don't exert nearly that amount of power, but they do, when it comes to EPA, because this is where, the road hits the rubber, is that EPA is very, it starts with the bee kills of the 80s. And I think EPA has a tradition of dealing with honeybee kills. But I do think there are systems, specifically even in Oregon, that have I think when the Savanto label went through, and I think Louisa is on the call and Ramesh remembers, bumblebee concerns were very predominant. And so I think EPA has a situation where they are looking, and squash bees that Stephanie mentioned as well, I think it's on EPA's radar as well as a kind of ground, and then there's a ground nesting bee research that's going on with soil, like soil treatments. But let's be careful with the honeybee keepers, because I think they really do the bulk of the pollination, because there is a kind of narrative out there. It's like, oh, well, if we just did habitat restoration, we could, pollinate blueberries. And I don't think that's borne out, at least in the West.
Alrighty, we are about 5 minutes to the hour, so if there are any additional questions or comments, I think now would be the time to make them, because we're going to be wrapping up here pretty soon. Is there any additional? I don't see any additional questions in the comments or in the chat.
I have one last thing just to mention. I saw Danny on here, and I think one place that this can work well is working with the IR4 program. Danny's always putting in plots, and I think there is I hadn't quite realized how powerful the connection with the IR4 program could be. And I think that's been something that I've come to appreciate over time. Anyways, thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for the March installment of the IPM Hour. In April, we have Cynthia O'Cam, who is going to talk about powdery mildew in hemp in the Pacific Northwest. Steve, anything else?
No, that was great, Andony. We really appreciate it.